and is a woman of many firsts. But I think this becomes even more important as we also launch, as we've also launched the Generation Equality Forum, and really we're bringing to the center stage the voices and contributions of young people. After all, the future that we want, we need to be able to create it. Like all protocol in any institution, we will start off our official welcome relations officer of DIRCO, Mom Charlotte Lobe. She also just recently published a book entitled My Father, My Hero, My Zero. Some very interesting and provocative title. Please take it away in terms of welcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitumesi, and thanks to Zandi and team for making it possible for us to converge here today. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to this exciting Youth Month webinar that observes the 45th anniversary of the youth uprisings of 1976 that started in Soweto. This year, we commemorate the Youth Month under the theme, and I quote, "The Year of Charlotte Manya Maxeke, Growing Youth Employment for an Inclusive and Transformed Society," I close quote. In order for us to unpack this theme, we thought it was critical for us to pause just for a moment and reflect on the economic justice and rights for youth, and particularly discuss the implications for Africa's demographic dividend. As we unpack this, we need to draw a distinction between demographic bulge and demographic dividend. Youth bulge is a demographic pattern where a large share of the population is comprised of children and youth. It is an important concept because it assists us to understand the future age cohorts and the emerging patterns that are critical for us to plan better as governments, as the private sector, as civil society. Demographic dividend, on the other hand, is the economic growth potential that can result from the shifts in population age structure. The demographic dividend is dependent on whether we make critical investment in the youthful population to harness, particularly the Africa's potential. I say this, ladies and gentlemen, because according to the 2015 report of the World Bank, Sub-Saharan Africa had the youngest population in the world. In 2015, young people under the age of 25 represented 76% of Africa's population, and the youth between the ages of 15 and 24 represented 1/5 of the world's youth population. In the same breath, it is estimated that by 2050, Africa will have about 362 million young people between the age of 15 and 24 years. From this data, it is clear in my mind that Africa will be demographically the world's youngest continent by 2050. The estimated number of young people entering the labor force, according to this World Bank report that I referred to, by 2050 would have exceeded that of the rest of the world combined of this webinar. We have observed that majority of young people are migrating from urban areas to further their studies, to look for, as well as look for greener pastures. It is my view that no matter where young people come from or where they go, the triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality defines their everyday reality. According to the 2017 ILO report, job creation, especially for young people, in most African countries remains totally disconnected from the population growth. And while this labor force is the continent's most important competitive advantage, unfortunately, 3 out of 5 of the unemployed are young people in the continent. Even the most skilled young people find themselves in low-paying jobs if and when they can find jobs. Even the most skilled young people, as I have said, they are still at the lowest levels of employment. Ladies and gentlemen, it is for this reason that we felt that as part of the Youth Month program, we needed to create space to discuss this very important topic, because we have noted that this high level of unemployment represents a real shortfall and severely limits the potential for a demographic dividend in the country. This youth could represent a real threat to the stability of the continent, because undereducated and unemployed young people are more exposed to illegal activities and the grip of armed conflict and terrorism. This structural unemployment of young people is largely due to a mismatch between training, skills offered, as well as employment requirements in the continent, a predominantly informal and insufficiently promoted entrepreneurship, a significant digital and technological divide, acute difficulties in accessing capital, and of course the scourge of corruption that is so rampant in the continent. As a result of the outbreak of COVID-19, we have observed that young people and women particularly are disproportionately affected by this pandemic. In the face of this global pandemic, the majority of young people are likely to be permanently excluded from labor markets, whilst others will be left behind as the world recovers from the pandemic and build back better. We need to harness the demographic dividend of youth through learning new ways of doing business in the midst of this capriciousness of the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, the year 2021 also marks the 15th anniversary of the African Youth Charter. We need to use the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the Youth Charter to take stock of the road we have traversed since the adoption of the Youth Charter, and most importantly, since the historic 1976 youth uprisings. This webinar provides us as a department, as well as our partner, the UN Women, an opportunity for young people to discuss the impact of our macroeconomic policies around the world and their impact on young people. This has to include discussions on issues such as tax justice, monetary and financial sector policies, and participatory and gender-responsive budgeting to advance socioeconomic rights of young people. Economic justice and right is not a favor, but a must for a democratic state like South Africa. The reason for this is that economic justice and rights are fundamental human rights, although they have been relegated to second-class rights compared to civil and political rights. We must make use of the opportunity created by Youth Month 2021 to discuss the changing nature of work and its impact of youth empowerment and development. We need to seriously engage on the principle of equal pay for work of equal value, and the need for new frameworks to promote decent work for young people free of violence and harassment as envisaged in the ILO Convention 190. It is the duty of young people continent, of course, globally, to advocate for the ratification of this convention, because young people are disproportionately affected by violence and harassment in the world of work. And by harassment, as you are aware, young women particularly are at the receiving end of harassment in the world of work. The occasion of this webinar must propel young conversation, amongst others, on climate justice as an indispensable element of economic justice. As we do this, we need to pay attention to how natural disasters disproportionately impact those least powerful and vulnerable, like women and young people. We must also look at the kind of economic reform and stimulus packages that are needed to better tackle natural disasters posed by climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, we must also use this occasion to reflect on the nexus between conflict and development. I raise this issue because post-conflict war hopes for a better world without wars, where conflicts between and within nations are peacefully resolved through negotiations, have not been fully realized. Recent data on armed conflicts indicates that countries affected by war typically also suffer sharp inequalities among social groups. It is this, rather than poverty, that seems to be a critical factor, although poor countries have been far more likely to be involved in armed conflicts than rich countries. Whether based on ethnicity, religion, national identity, or economic class, inequality tends to be reflected in unequal access to political power that often foreclose paths to peaceful change. Economic decline and mismanagement are also associated with violent conflicts, not least because the politics of a shrinking economy are inherently prone to conflicts as compared to countries with thriving economies. In the same breath, conflict only rupture countries' developments. They are often the consequence of failure of the country to develop, and young people are unfortunately at the receiving end of conflicts. Ladies and gentlemen, most crises and violent conflicts, as I said before, amongst others by poverty, economic hardships, violation and manipulations of constitutions, violation of human rights, exclusions, inequalities, marginalization, and mismanagement of Africa's rich ethnic diversity, as well as relapses into the cycle of violence in some post-conflict settings and external interference in Africa's affairs. It is my view that in order for us to address all of these issues, young people must use their agency in bringing the continent together and ensuring that we put our continent into, or we put our continent on this path of growth and development. In 2020, under South Africa's AU chairship, the AU hosted a policy brief on promoting youth entrepreneurship in Africa. During this brief, an important point was made where the AU recognized the importance of investing in young people and creating a conducive environment for youth development. This, of course, is in line with the AU Agenda 2063 that seeks to ensure that young people realize their potential, including going beyond the limited formal employment opportunities and creating and availing opportunities to make a decent living. The AU, through its African Plan of Action for Youth Empowerment, has placed high premium on 5 key priority areas, and as a result of time, I'll not go through the 5 areas. Amongst them is youth employment and entrepreneurship. Furthermore, the AU Commission has rolled out a 1 million initiative by 2021. The initiative is aimed at reaching millions of youth from across the continent with opportunities and interventions in key areas of employment, entrepreneurship, education, and engagement to harness the demographic dividend for Africa's population backbone, as well as mitigate the economic shock waves on youth empowerment. The AU identified about 6 interventions that are important for this webinar. The first one is engaging youth directly in entrepreneurship-related policy making, integrating relevant education with entrepreneurship skills development, supporting and enhancing and enabling entrepreneurial ecosystem, employing and supporting smart and effective financing for startups, particularly for social enterprises addressing a specific gap, niche, or a problem. Leveraging and strengthening partnerships and other stakeholders, as well as promoting gender-responsive programming. Ladies and gentlemen, having said this, I hope that the webinar of today will assist us through our esteemed panelists to look at, amongst others, the urgent, targeted, and smarter investment required for decent work for youth, including the protection of young people's human rights, employment and training programs, social protection, and unemployed insurance benefits for youth, as well as greater efforts to boost the quality and delivery of online and distance learning. And lastly, stronger complementarities with mental health services, as well as social support for improved health and well-being outcomes for young people. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this webinar, and I declare the webinar open. Thank you very much, moderator, Ms. Kitumesi.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lobe. What an important and substantive, introduction. I think you really did a good job at setting the participants. What we don't know, or maybe some of us may not know, is that Ms. Lobe sits on the Global Steering Committee for the Generation Equality Forum, and what's even more profound is the fact that South Africa is leading the Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights. And I think we can all agree that as a country, we are in amazing hands in terms of the caliber of leadership that is representing us on a global level. But I think what is very important, with that being said, what is very important and some key takeaways we can take from that opening statement is the fact that the crisis of, youth participation, particularly at an economic level, is number one, is fundamental to human rights, but also requires approach. And in order for us to be able to facilitate those kind of interventions that are needed to ensure that, youth are actively participating in shaping the economies, not only of the country, but of the continent at large, that we actively get them involved in processes of governance. And I think today's webinar really seeks to ignite those conversations, to also assess where is the level of thinking in terms of youth interventions? What are we as the youth of this country saying the proposed solutions and interventions look like to addressing what seems to be quite a huge mountain that is confronting the youth of not only South Africa, but of the continent at large? I think what was quite important in Ms. Lobe's contributions was that although she eloquently articulated the myriad of challenges facing youth in this continent, she also was able to alert us, and create awareness around the endless opportunities associated with the fact that
task in a sense, because I need to talk about something that is a global conversation, but I need to bring it to the level of the conversation that we're having now in terms of domestication and making sure that it's relevant for our discussion. And of course, I am the lead within the presidency that is working on the Generation Equality Forum, which is what I've been asked to do. Now, I was conscious as soon as I was invited to come and speak here, I was quite conscious about the fact that this is a conversation on youth. And so the immediate question, given the fact that generation equality is really an ambitious movement of global actors, so across governments, civil society, business, and basically anybody and everybody around the world, who are coming together and saying it's time for us to begin to implement game-changing actions to transform our economies, to transform our social systems, our legal systems, so that we move towards gender equality. So essentially, that's what generation equality is about. And because this is an agenda about gender equality, the concern that I had at the back of my mind was, how do I make sure that I am not excluding the other important half of our population, particularly amongst our youth population? So the first thing then I thought I would do is to just contextualize why generation equality is important. Firstly, because we already know around the world that there is overwhelming evidence that anything that is a form of economic injustice that's going on around the world today disproportionately affects women, and particularly young women at that. So whether you are looking at your statistics about who owns businesses, who is able to participate in the economy through employment, who are the majority of the people in the informal sector, essentially the negative bias across all of those major economic indicators are women. And therefore, when we're thinking about transforming global economies, it's absolutely essential that we think about how do we bring women on par to men as we are busy in the process of trying to transform our economies. A second really important thing is the justice factor. All forms of inequality in this country, we have a historic track record of saying that we despise inequality and injustice of any form. And so the youth of 1976 are evidence of that. And given the fact that the systematic and systemic exclusion of women in economies is recognized as an injustice, it really isn't possible to talk about any form that greed and debauchery essentially are the essence that lead how, governments and businesses, etc., manage themselves. And so we see this through environmental degradation. We see this through really unbelievable forms of inequality. Any form, therefore, of a restorative agenda towards our economies has to actually ensure that it's an inclusive agenda, which essentially takes us both to the recovery and the COVID ways and the work that needs to happen in that sector to both formalize that sector as well as to protect women that work within that sector. Then, of course, we've got decent work, which I won't speak too much about, except to say we've been highlighting the fact that when we are thinking about decent work, we need to think about that in the context both of formalized labor as well as the informal sector, which particularly becomes important for the African context. Productive resources was a game changer as far as I'm concerned in how we began to conceptualize economic transformation, because it really speaks to what are the things that need to take place to ensure that we are transferring power. In other words, access to and control over productive resources to women. As long as we don't recognize where power lies and the things that enable that power, which essentially means the assets that enable people to participate in the economy, it's not possible for either youth or women to begin to play a role in our economies, as it were. And so there's a massive amount of work that took place in that area. And then, of course, macroeconomic policies is what inclusive policies refers to there. How do we budget? Do we have a youth lens when we budget? Do we have a gendered lens when we budget? I don't really have enough time to go through the detail of all of this. So I will summarize it very, very briefly, but I wanted to give you a sense of when we began to tease out each of the themes, what did we end up with? Because we were saying, let's ensure that there's a clear action. Let's ensure that there's a clear target that we want to achieve across each one of them. So then initially I said to you, theme one was around the K economy, the overall objective being the intention to increase women's economic empowerment by transforming the K economy. I would say in the context of South Africa, it's important to then ask the question, how can youth and young people specifically participate in that space? And the intention or the action we want to take here is to recognize, reduce, redistribute unpaid care work, reward paid care work, and guarantee care workers' labor rights and their increased representation, in other words, voice, as it were. The reason why this is important is because we begin to realize that there is a massive amount of work that happens within what we are calling a K economy right now, whether it's around domestic responsibilities or whether it's around responsibilities that women and possibly even youth, play in society, which are not quantified in any way. And because they are not quantified in any way, their measure of GDP contribution is undermined, underestimated, which means that there are no policies and there are no systems in place to actually ensure that those who are participating in that economy are protected. So then we began to tease out the commitments necessary in the legal space in relation to data and in relation to financing, which I don't have enough time to go through right now. The second theme, just to tease out again there, the key objective and the key action that we agreed on. So this is now around decent work, and the intention is to expand decent work and employment in the formal and informal economies by creating an enabling legal and policy environment and engage women to expand decent work in the formal and informal sectors to diminish the number of working women living in poverty by 2026. We know that most people that are actually working, both young people as well as women that are working, are defined as the working poor, because even though they have jobs, they don't have decent jobs that allow them to actually eke out a livelihood, as it were. So this is what we're talking about here. And we're saying we want to have a target of reducing those people that are participating in the economy, but that are not making enough money for their families, as it were. And then, of course, to increase the number of women who benefit from preferential procurement from the public sector and the private sector. Again, we began to tease that out in relation to legal provisions, in relation to service delivery, as well as in relation to financing, as it were. Theme 3 has to do with increasing women's access to and control over productive resources. And here we wanted to expand women's access to and control over productive resources to increase gender-responsive financial products and services, access to and control over land, and the number of businesses or firms that are owned by women. So this is an important one because, as I'm highlighting on the screen for you, I think it's groundbreaking that we find what productive resources are. In the past, in economics, productive resources primarily referred to ownership of land. Here we redefined the definition, and we said everything that's an asset and an enabler for someone to participate in the economy is a productive resource. So access to finance, energy, internet access, and any of those kinds of resources. And the commitment we're looking for here is to secure access and ownership over land, to reduce the gender gap in financial services by 6%, or rather down to 6%, and to increase the number of businesses that are owned by women. Madam Moderator, I'm almost done. And I'm going to skip this bit. And then theme number 4 is to engender economic reforms and stimulus packages. And here, this was primarily about designing and implementing gender-responsive macroeconomic plans and budget reforms and stimulus packages so that 85 more women and girls are supported by quality public social protection floors and systems by 2026. Would you believe that amongst the stimulus packages that have been implemented around the world, very few of them actually focused on women? And I believe that there was a limited number of them that were focusing on youth as well, because the primary focus of the current global system is let's take care of our big business. What we're saying is that in your budgeting reforms, when you are planning, it's important that the whole macroeconomic framework changes and begins to address the needs of women, and in our case, the needs of young people as well. Now, part of my background really is as an activist. I'm an economic activist, if you like. And I thought I would end off in the 1 minute I have left I would end off by highlighting for me, having given you a sense of how we are defining economic justice and rights across these 4 themes globally. I think it's important to then localize this and say, what are the key thought points that are necessary for young people in this country to actually take forward? First of all, I think it's important to be aware and conscious of what I call structural transformation. The time of tinkering around the edges is really over, because if we don't constantly challenge ourselves to say, are we making transformative change here? Is this issue going to change fundamentally how this economy works? Or is this thing just going to be great for the next 6 to 12 months, but really is not going to cause any fundamental change into the future? Because where we are at right now, we do actually have the opportunity to transform structurally how our economy works. So we need to that can happen. Secondly, is that this country has identified key areas in the process of economic reform that we have said are important. And we're calling those entry points, or rather I'm calling those entry points into the economy, which means that young people and young women in this country must identify what are the sectors where government right now is paying attention, where big business is paying attention and saying, in order to grow this economy, we need to go back into these industries and we need to invest, we need to create new industries. The care economy is an example as this country. This is an area where we did not see an industry before, but now we see an industry, which means there's a potential to own businesses in that industry. There's a potential for new employment. There's a potential even for new sub-industries within the care economy that we didn't know before, such as, for instance, digitally enabled care systems, as it were. So it's important to be thinking about very strategically what are those entry points and how do we leverage them. Then leveraging existing opportunities. This country, our president announced last year a commitment of 40% preferential procurement for women. We already know that youth were already part of the preferential procurement of government, 50%, I believe it is. I may be wrong in my stats, I need to check that. But we already, through our BEE process, we know that we already had identified and earmarked those groups that we said were designated groups, and young people particularly are part of those groups. So when we realize that there are opportunities in the system that are beginning to open up, then it's important to say, how do we quickly activate so that we can take advantage of those opportunities and begin to do business with government, the private sector. A company like Clicks that's saying we are now wanting to procure locally most of our cosmetic products. How do we then ensure that as the youth sector in this country, we are very quickly companies within that sector and ensuring that there are those products that are growing. And then, of course, independent, bold innovation.
Madam Speaker?
Is my time over?
Yes, but I will extend grace of 15 seconds for you just to wrap up your thoughts, and then we need to move on. Thank you.
You're very generous. Thank you. So maybe I'll say this as the last thing. Independent, bold innovation for me has to do with one of the core things around generation equality is that governments alone cannot change economies. So I think there's a boldness that's going to need to come from South African citizens broadly to say, how do we make this happen for ourselves? Because globally, evidence shows that really it is small businesses that are family-based or community-based that change economies. And it's essential that we begin to move towards that agenda. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and apologies for the time.
Thank you so much. I think we can all agree. Yeah, no, this panel is off to a heated start, you know. We can all agree that the idea of economic justice and rights is a thing, you know, and more often than not, we struggle to make the relationship between youth participation and, you know, serious economic reform. And thank you for highlighting some of the low-hanging fruit. You know, I think one of, you know, as you said, one of the key things we can really push as a country at a localized level is the bold commitments coming from youth leaders in driving and influencing the discourse around economic justice and rights. But I want to urge everyone who's on the platform, if you haven't already, the Paris leg of Generation Equality Forum kicks off on the 30th of June, so this coming Wednesday. If you haven't already, please make sure that you are registered to engage and to hear what are some of the bold commitments being made at a global level. At the end of the day, the most important thing that we can do as young activists, as young leaders in our respective industries, is to take global commitments and localize them so that they're able to respond to the crisis that we see in our country. But I think what's also important, what I really took from Namka's contribution, is around the gendered perspective. Because the reality of the matter is that we live gendered lives, right? Our engagement and interaction with the economy is from a gendered perspective. And so it's important when we're thinking about, solutions to advancing economic justice and rights, that we're very intentional about a gendered perspective. But also understanding that, this economic transformation that we're so desperately in need of needs to happen at several levels of society, from the individual communities and at a macro or structural level. And, I must be honest with you, Namta, I was really excited when you spoke about structural transformation. Myself, as somebody who's interested in structural policy, it's really important that we're able to locate the solutions to the social ills that we see at a structural level, because it's the structures that maintain and reinforce some of the issues that we find are so prevalent in South African communities and in the continent at large. Speaking about structural interventions and macro policy, I invite next Ms. Busi Sibeko. She's from the Institute for Economic Justice. She's an economist, very sharp, very brave, very daring, and she is going to present a case for the pro-employment macroeconomic policy. As we would know, the start of Youth Month was quite a bittersweet one, right? Although we were entering the month celebrating the 45th anniversary since the 1976 Youth Uprising, we were also met with the harsh reality that 74.4% of South African youth between the ages of 15 and 35 are unemployed. And so even when we think about economic justice, we must be able to address the big elephant in the room, which is the fact that 7 out of 10 people that you may know are unemployed. And this is regardless of the fact that they may be skilled or unskilled. And so it's important that when we think about economic justice and rights, that we think about how do we use the current and existing structures and the policy framework to ensure that we're able to find long-term tangible solutions to addressing youth unemployment in this country. Busi, you've got a tough one to speak on, but we're hopeful that you are going to give us something to nibble on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I don't know if you can see me. I haven't been able to see the other speakers. I hope. Yes. Okay. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining and listening to my inputs today, and thank you for this great invitation to be here. And what I want to start off with to say that we are in a crisis of orthodoxy, and what I mean by that is that all these issues that have been exacerbated by the current COVID crisis emerged from this orthodox economics that has emerged over the last century. And I'll be unpacking what that means. But what I want to start off with by saying is that more of the same will not give us different results. So saying that current policies are adequate and we just need to do them better will not give us better results, because that is what we have been doing since 1994. That is what has been done globally for a very long time. Since the 70s already on the African continent, we saw structural adjustment programs which were supposed to make our economies better. But what ended up happening is that we had a lost decade on the African continent of growth, and also we saw inequalities rise, and we saw all these negative outcomes. And to say that knowing what we know about the outcomes of the current economic structures and policies, we should know better, and we need to actually think differently about our economies and what policies are needed. So to start off, I always, I think some people have heard me speak. I always say we need to understand that our economy is in a crisis of neoliberal capitalism and patriarchy. And when I talk about neoliberal capital market is unable to actually provide the jobs for everyone who wants them. That's the first. The other is cyclical unemployment, which means that we do not have efficient demand in our economy, right? So the unemployed, there are more unemployed, there are job vacancies, but also in terms of adequate demand in our economy. And as we know, South Africa is quite poor, right? We know from 2015 already that more than half of our population lives below the upper bound poverty line, which means that if people can't buy the goods that are produced, then you can't produce for producing sake, right? There has to be adequate demand for those goods to be used. But I want to go to this quote by Marx, which links in this question of unemployment to capitalism itself. Marx said, "It is the very nature of capitalistic mode of production to overwork some workers while keeping the rest as a reserve army of unemployed paupers." And I think this is very critical, right? In understanding what kind of system do we want. Capitalism isn't the only system that has ever existed in our history of societies. And so fundamentally to challenge that, we need to challenge this that it trickles down from economic level impacts down to the household. And I would argue that budget cuts are actually going to be detrimental, particularly for women and youth and the vulnerable, because those are the people who rely on public services more, disproportionately more. Women rely on public services because they're critical for their social reproductive work. So I think we need to rethink the role of the state. I think I beg to differ a bit with the previous speaker around, governments alone cannot change economies in a way, because I think the role of the state has been significantly undermined over time. And in fact, how else would we redistribute wealth from these large companies, Amazons, digital companies, and so forth, than if the states come together and say, we need an international minimum tax that says that all these companies are liable for tax, and that's how we're going to redistribute wealth. We need better labor policies, market policies. We need better sectoral policies. That is driven largely by the state and of course by, in support with business and other stakeholders. But I do think that in the South African context in particular, there has been too little of a focus on macroeconomic policies. And we are almost moving from a space that says our macroeconomic policy is okay, and if we just gender it, it will be better. And I'll argue that our macroeconomic policy is not okay, and in fact, gendering it will still reproduce the same ills that we are currently seeing. For example, more women in the workforce does not mean that gender wage gaps go away. It does not mean that disproportionately represented in precarious work, which is what has a study being released this week that shows how women, because of their overrepresentation in precarious work, low-paying work, low-skilled work, are the ones who've lost more jobs during COVID. And so fundamentally, we need better labor policies around such things. And we also need to not just focus on supply side. A lot of how do we better educate? How do we better make people ready for the labor market? But the reality is there are no jobs. No matter how ready your labor force is, and this is a huge issue for the youth, no matter how ready this youth is going to be, skills-wise, demand in the economy, for as long as there's no economy to join into, in a way, so to speak, we'll always have a large unemployment. And so it is critical, again, and I liked that point earlier about investing in the economy. It is our government's job to say, we are going to invest in employment-intensive sectors. We're going to make sure we provision the financial support that is needed to help these sectors build, but also climate just. We are going to be invested, maybe private sector doesn't want to come to the floor and create green jobs, but our state has to fundamentally play that role to say, we envision a future economy that is green, that is inclusive, that is this and that, and we can add all these things, feminist, I would add, and that they are going to ultimately create a stimulus package. This is where we are in South Africa. We need a stimulus.
Thank you for that, Busi. I must, maybe my lenient approach is not working too much, but I want to inform all our speakers that you have a maximum of 10 minutes to speak. It would be great if you could keep it under 7, given that we are pressed for time. But really provocative and statements made by you, Busi, in terms of how do we even envision this transformation to occur within the current economic system? Asking fundamental questions to say, this really, capitalism isn't the only economic system that's ever existed. Since we're seeing a collapse of so many primary human factors, such as the social and environmental, maybe it's time that part of our bold leadership and innovative thinking, as proposed by NAMPLA, requires us to think about alternative economic systems. With that being said, we're going to jump into our next speaker, Ms. Khululiwe, who is a human rights attorney. Her work broadly focuses on cultural rights. Recently, she has been taking cases of informal traders, domestic workers, and illegal evictions. As mentioned in NAMPLA's presentation, that justice is closely, access also to participate in the economy. And so
then they're not. Today, I'll just be discussing the two thematic areas, what the law says and what the jurisprudence has been, particularly from the Constitutional Court, being the apex court in our country. So over the past 10 years, we've been very fortunate to have very progressive jurisprudence in terms of evictions. So in South Africa, we have the PI Act, which is the Prevention of Illegal Evictions Act, which came into effect in the late 90s with the purpose of replacing the previous legislation, which really, if you could prove that this is your land, you could evict anyone. So this act is really aimed at ensuring that no one is evicted from their home without an order of court. And before that court makes that order, they need to be able to satisfy themselves with all the personal circumstances of those people who stand to be evicted by that order. So one of the requirements specifically set out in the legislation, is it a child-headed household? Is it a woman-headed household? How many women are there? Because of the clear understanding of the disproportionate situations that women and young people generally find themselves in. And for the longest time, while the Act makes all of these requirements, it did not guard to be rendered homeless by the eviction. And this is a very important victory for evictees who, for years of an eviction, and they have nowhere to be because most of these people come to seek employment. So now at least there is that security of tenure, because I don't think you can even start to think about making a living and all of these things if you don't have a roof over your head. So this then fits in nicely with our areas, because you're having these very same people who would stand to be evicted also participating in the informal economy. Most of these people, informal traders and informal reclaimers, because of the work that they do and the income really being limited to just making ends meet, they're unable to afford to rent or buy property. So they find themselves in these buildings. So what the Constitutional Court has said about informal traders, as well as informal reclaimers, really, it has emphasized on the right to make a living as being an important component of the right to human dignity, which is we find in our Constitution, Section 10 of our Constitution. So that is why it's very important for the state and everyone to just advance these rights, see this work as proper work. Recently, in our work with domestic workers, we challenged the constitutional validity of the COIDA Act, which is Compensation of Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act. So this act excluded domestic workers from being able to claim for injuries or deaths that occur during their employment while they're working. So for this case, she died while she was at work, and her descendants could not claim because the act did not allow that. So that says about how the law before the decision that came from the Constitutional Court last year saw women who work in the domestic work space, because it's a space that is dominated by mostly women. And over the years, through our research and advocacy, we've come to realize that more and more young people are entering the space. And precisely because of what the speaker was talking about, no matter how skilled you are, if there's no demand in the sector, then a lot of people find themselves in the informal sector. So what we're finding is that we're having more young people being domestic workers, being informal traders, engaging in formal reclaiming activities. And that is why it's important for this sector to get support and encouragement from the municipality and the state at large. And the reason why so far the support or the purported support from the state has not worked is there is this notion of wanting to transform the sector to formal and taking away the informality. And the sector is thriving merely because it's informal. So I think it's important to have these discussions. It's unfortunate that we're having the pandemic and we have to have these virtual meetings, but it's important to have these discussions with the people whose rights are adversely affected, the domestic workers who are subjected to harassment and all of these things in the workplace, who are having to go all the way up to the Constitutional Court, enduring 5 years or plus of litigation in order to just have their basic human rights of choosing their trades recognized. So far, like I said, the South African law oh, sorry, Kitty Betsy. How long do I have?
I can only give you 30 seconds now.
Okay, not a problem. Thank you. So I think the most important things is we have the legislation. The jurisprudence is slowly moving towards the right direction with the lobbying of organizations such as ourselves. What we need is political willingness from the states to engage people and to see really the informal sector as people who are doing decent work and empower the rights of women and young girls, as we're seeing that it's more and more people who are coming into the space. It's young people and particularly young girls. So thank you very much for having me. I'd hope I'd have much more time, because as a lawyer, I never have such little time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those important contributions. You know, I think it's always important when we think about some of the structural changes that we want to see. Many times it feels very abstract, but we are reminded again, and I think your presentation was a beautiful reminder to say that people are working and organizing for survival. You know, we see that civil society organizations have become very critical in providing alternative discourse to what economic justice and rights is doing. And so the work that Seri is doing is nothing short of that. In the interest of time, I would love to jump on to the next speaker. You know, just to recap a little, you know, Ms. Lobe spoke about, you know, how we're seeing massive an increase in internal and external migration across the African continent. And I mean, that can't be separated from the fact that we are increasingly becoming a globalized society. I think the big question then becomes, how does South Africa leverage or maximize the current partnerships that it already has? To answer this question, we've got Karabo Mohale, who is a board chair from the Tshwane Institute for Continuing Education, and she's also the deputy chairperson of South African BRICS Youth Association. Karabo, I know, like many young people, we're all dying to know, how does South Africa maximize, you know, the BRICS collaboration that we've got going on? We look forward to hearing your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I really do hope that I can try to truncate my entire presentation in the time that you have allocated me. But let me greet the leadership of DECO panelists, and really just want to thank them for this opportunity, and also the investment in intergenerational dialogues. But I think we must be able to challenge ourselves beyond just having conversations and saying, how do we ensure that young people become part and parcel of the development trajectory? How do we locate them at the nerve center of policy making, as well as trying to find different ways to harness their skills and their expertise, you know? As we're reflecting, you know, we're celebrating Dr. Charlotte Matlak, a pioneering tower of strength. And I think as and when we have this conversation, we must present a blueprint about an economy and society that is very inclusive, that is intersectional. And it is important because as and when we have conversations, we must ensure that nobody is left behind. And more often than not, when we're having high panel and high level discussions, we often forget young people, young women in the far-flung areas of economic activity. So I think it is very important for us to build an inclusive economy and inclusive society that is also safe for women, the LGBTQI+ community, and persons with disability. What I must also say, Program Director, is that I really think that we need to build a government that is socially conscious, you know, and has life-changing responses to gender-based violence, to rape in the country, because we are leading, according to a report from Interpol, sexual harassment in the workplace, unfair labor practices, and even human trafficking. And this we're saying because the violence that is there in the economy is a consequence of the violence that is there in the society. And if we don't change some of the patriarchal anomalies and some of these violent tendencies that we see in the society, we will not be able to realize the progress that we would want to see as a country. And I think those are some of the things that we need to respond to. Transformation must be institutionalized. Inclusion must be institutionalized. It is non-negotiable. If we don't include everybody, including those that are in the periphery, then we're going to continue with a country that has got one of the highest Gini coefficients in the whole world, where the poor become more poorer and the richer become more richer. So I think it is important for us to have a reflection that as and when we're building and trying to leverage on economic partnerships, we're able to say, to answer the question, how do we not leave others behind? And I think there are three things, Program Director, that I just want to mention. That one, education is an equalizer. And I think we need, when you are thinking about the people of Cuba, you're thinking about the doctors that have been spread across the whole and be able to ensure that it grows and builds capacity to absorb young people who are unemployed. And the last part is going to be an intentional action towards building financial support for young people. And if we don't bring about, whether it is a development bank for young people, there needs to be a pool of money that we bring together to support young youth-owned enterprises so that they can be able to grow, they can be able to have access to the economy. So I'm going to conclude here, Program Director, because I'm trying to rush because you had mentioned that we do not have time. But I really must say, as I conclude, responsibility to put interventions in place that do not deepen the crisis. And austerity measures are deepening the crisis. We need to ensure that the collaborative efforts that we put together are towards us building a new social compact. We need to disrupt anomalies that have been normalized in the society and in the economy, and we really need to stand up and change the course of history. And my parting shot is that there is nothing greater than justice, and I think we have a responsibility to ensure that we fight for economic and social justice. Thank you, Program Director.
Thank you so much, Karabo. Very interesting, very dynamic contributions made. Interesting to see the challenge in terms of ideology from the different speakers. How we're all looking at the same problem, but we're providing different solutions and perspectives to what the solutions look like to the problem. emphasizing the need for intersectional solution finding and developing is important, especially when we think about a gendered perspective to economic justice and rights, and also being able to maximize and leverage on the global market. Because believe it or not, our economic transformation cannot happen in silos, right? And this is why platforms like the Generation Equality Forum are so important, so that we're able to build global solidarity to address some of the biggest social ills that we find. And I think it's even more important that those in the global south, particularly those of that BRICS Cabral, you really come up with collaborative measures in terms of addressing some of the economic downfalls that we're seeing in our country, but also around the idea of having a socially conscious, kind of governance is really important. And I think we can't think about socially conscious governance without thinking about the care economy, which has been eloquently, articulated by both Busi and Namtla. With that being said, there's so much happening in so little time.
All right, thank you so much. I was just appreciating the leadership of Durko for creating this platform of youth dialogues, but not only creating the platform of youth dialogues, but today adding a special touch of ensuring the visibility of young, incredible women who have authority to speak on the issue, the notion that there are no young women in the spaces. And, whatever efforts you have taken to unearth these rare gems, you are really applauded, because the more we see the faces that look like us speaking of complex topics, the more it inspires us to look into those topics, to learn from them, to become what they inspire us to be and to grow. Mine here today, my name is Morongo Mutiba, as the panel, the facilitator has indicated, and I'm here to speak about the role of technology in harnessing the dividend, the demographic dividend. It is no secret that today is 45 years since the 16th June 1976 student uprising in Soweto. A truly unforgettable day in South Africa. The month of June in general commemorates those youth and their struggle for social justice. 45 years later, the most glaring socio-economic problem facing the youth is unemployment. The high rate of youth unemployment is a reflection, firstly, of the difficulties young people face in entering the labor market, but it's also, a shadow of the mismatch between the experience level that is required by employers, or as the former speaker spoke of, a mismatch in demand, the demand of the market vis-a-vis the employees that we are developing, or potential employees that we are developing. And this is shown by the number of graduates without employment. But the context is deepened by COVID-19. Prior to lockdown, this unemployment in general and youth unemployment in particular were always severe and disheartening. And whilst we acknowledge the efforts to save lives from various response teams, what we do note is that there has been an exacerbated crisis of youth employment, or youth unemployment as it may be, as a result of COVID-19. We have young people who had work, the few that had work, losing work in retrenchments, and we have even more young people failing to get placement in the economy. This has affected their ability to, create a living for themselves. This has affected their ability, to cope in terms of mental health. Some of them are suffering from, strokes and depression and all kinds of illnesses. And as a result, we feel that it is important for us to continue to have these dialogues, not only to highlight the challenges that we have as a society, but also emphasize the opportunities that we can harness so that we can inspire hope amongst those young people who are listening in here today, and those who can advocate for policy change that will give us a brighter future. It is no secret that the fourth industrial revolution is upon us, and the future is tech. It is within the economic justice lens that we come here today to present
what we view as, you know, a way to bridge the challenges that we see in society today. The South African National Development Plan predicts that 90% of all new jobs will come from small, medium, and micro-sized enterprises by 2030. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report reflects that SMMEs in South Africa contribute to 36% of the country's gross domestic product. These statistics fuel our perspective as Lord Vision that transforming the country's key resources, which are its youth, from unemployed to employed or employment makers, is a critical and urgent task that we aspire to progress and to advocate for. And whilst we have an acute appreciation of the immediate challenges brought on by the pandemic, it is our responsibility as youth-led and youth-centric organizations to develop, advocate, and implement the pragmatic solutions of young people. Chair, due to time, I will rush into some of the thoughts we have to share with regards to what those solutions may entail. Firstly, Chair, we would like to say that while many shops closed their doors in 2020 and 2021, internet service providers, businesses boomed with everyone demanding remote working tools and home-based entertainment, predominantly online. Beyond 2021, it is time for the internet service providers to give back to the communities they benefited from during this pandemic and to also close the inequality gap. How can they do this? How can we advocate for them to do this? While the cost of data to study, to work remotely, to socialize, to organize, and to sell goods and services online is a significant financial exclusion and a major barrier of entry to academics and for job seeking and opportunity seeking. We like to advocate today for the lowering of the cost of data, but beyond the lowering of the cost of data, for zero rating of certain essential must-haves. For example, as part of the right to work, we consider the zero rating of job portals as an absolute necessity. We also say that there is an immediate need for a directed and targeted ICT infrastructure development in rural areas. We know that there is an incentive to create or fast track the access to data and spectrum in the urban hubs. But in order to bridge the inequality gap brought about by the historical spatial planning of the apartheid system, we need to be deliberate and intentional about our development of the infrastructure. This will not only enable young people in the rural areas to have. Hello?
Madam Speaker, you have 30 seconds tops to summarize your thoughts. Thank you.
Oh my, I only have started 4 minutes ago. Okay, it's fine. Let me quickly wrap it up. We also believe in if we can envision a municipal trade center as it is, as it is currently done for hawkers to trade, is it really beyond our imagination to envision a state-led online platform, the likes of Amazon or Alibaba? We could do this as a textile hub facilitating trade among sellers, seamstresses, and we could also do it amongst artisans and so forth. And those could fast track opportunities that would bridge the gender and employment divide. We have quite a few suggestions to promote technology as a means of economic justice. However, we'll reserve them for another opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. Apologies for having to put you on the spot like that. But unfortunately, you know how these things work. As you said, data still remains a massive challenge in our country, and so does access. With that being said, I would like to open. We have about 20 minutes before we end off the session. I would like to open up for contributions, questions that can be directed at either of the speakers. We can just maybe do a bit of reading in terms of some of the comments. Oh, we've got Larry on the line. Larry, you can go ahead.
Hi, Madam Chair. Now, what I was going to suggest, and I guess you beat me to it, perhaps the conversations are not, I don't know, everyone participated in the conversations in the chat, but I think some of the conversation that was raised by Ms. Dube and by Nikita, I think, and as well by Levi, I think that would be a good starting point, because I'd be quite curious as what's the position. I think all the panelists have prepared quite well for engagement, and I guess short of time, they couldn't address all the and give them opportunity to further elaborate on what they tried to articulate. And well done to Ms. Karabo as well. Hers was very on point.
Thank you so much for that, Larry, for those contributions that were made. I am trying to get right to the top of the chat. It seems so heated. I'm struggling to figure out where the start is. But a comment from Nikita that says empowerment has just become a hymn, just like GBV. More action, more development, more service support, release resources for working group, fund working, and government needs to accept that governments can't do it all, which means we're calling for greater action from different sectors of society. Some great remarks from Karabo Mohale, from some of the participants. There is Larry asks, why are we looking to reward entities for including youth as a financial agenda? Companies should be more penalized for not doing so. Legislation must be changed. The last amendment to the NYDA was lip service. The youth has been set up to fail. Now is being passed the mantle to continue and to change the mess we are in. We need to be realistic. So some really strong provocations coming up from the Busi say they do reward entities for including youth. There is an employment tax incentive. It's just not working as anticipated. And I guess that is some of the contradictions we need to deal with. To say that South Africa does have quite an inclusive macro policy, but what happens between the policy development and implementation? And I think, at the heart of that is being able to have young, bright, brave leaders who are able to spearhead some of the solutions that have been proposed in today's session, or it's an existing hand.
Apologies, Madam Chair, it was an old hand.
Okay, so this one is directed to, okay, before I go into that, we've got a hand from Sibusiso. Sibusiso, you may go through.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you for all of the presentations. Has come through. And the beautiful thing that I'm actually picking up is that many people are working on issues to deal with youth from various sectors. And I think platforms like this, with various sectors, a multi-sectorial is needed. More sessions like this are needed because we are all doing things. It seems as if we're all doing things in different silos. So government is working in its own silo. NGOs are working in their silos. Us as academics are working in our own silos. And yet there are many lessons that we can learn from each other if we keep these channels open. So I'd like to encourage the organizers perhaps to set up some kind of database where we can have each other's email addresses, contact details, as well as our roles in our various organizations. So as going forward, we can continue to have such dialogues, but also when we think of doing work, perhaps with young people, and we want to find out and know who to speak to, who to, go to, just so that we end up not trying to reinvent the wheel over and over again in our various silos. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much for that, for kickstarting us into what collaboration looks like across sectors. Levi, you can go through.
Thank you, comrade, and incredible moderation on your end. Thank you so much for facilitating us so expertly, and to the panel for their incredible contributions. I think just to reflect on the theme overarching this dialogue in terms of the demographic dividend, I think we need to also bear in mind that the demographic dividend isn't necessarily premised solely on decent work and employment. We also understand that there are 4 other key factors that have been identified by the African Union's demographic dividend roadmap, such as health and well-being, education at that, civic participation and human rights, and also governance and accountability. And in 2017, when the African Union had developed the roadmap, it was on states to domesticate national roadmaps, to explicitly state what are the policy and legislative shifts that need to be seen and the investments that need to be freed up to ensure that the demographic dividend is realized. And I do think that we've started off an incredible and insightful discussion, but it would be good to see how we can now work in these streams, but also look at some of the streams that aren't covered. So gender, climate change, urbanization, migration, and to look at how we pull together. And I think the previous speaker had echoed the sentiment of it would be good to put together a database. And I would go a step further to say that maybe we need to convene with support from our UN partners as well as DIRCO to look at how we could possibly put together some sort of think tank to reevaluate South Africa's position on the demographic dividend, because it could be argued that we aren't moving towards realizing a demographic dividend at the moment, but rather a demographic disaster due to our lack of innovation, our lack of effort, and our lack of intention in terms of some of these investments. So definitely let's pull together on putting a working group of sort to focus on some of these areas. Thanks, Kitsumetsi.
Thank you so much for that. That sounds more like a clearing call. Zandi and your team, I hope that you have noted a verbal proposal to convene and hopefully establish a think tank. The ideas are there, the energies are there. I think we're all quite brave and we're eager to really get the work done and started. With that being said, I will close off our Q&As, but I will encourage, if you want to continue keeping up the conversations moving forward, let's drop our contact details. We do live in a time of social media and digital communication. So let's exchange our handles and contact details and see maybe, Zandi, how we can strengthen this network of young, brilliant thinkers. I've noted you, Zandi. Maybe I can take your hand before we hand over for our closing remarks. Zandi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You've done a stellar job facilitating this team. And I just wanted to say to all the panelists, thank you for this amazing information sharing and the ideas you've shared. But just broadly to the participants, yes, we are here as the Office of the COO. We are listening to some of the note of my email address, which I'm going to put on the chat group, because I'm very interested to take some of these ideas forward. So without spending or taking too much of your time, yes, I will be putting my email address, and let's take this conversation forward. This was only meant to be a teaser. So it's 4 dialogues. The next one is on Wednesday. Please be on the lookout, because we're still going to be discussing intergenerational leadership. So let's be on the lookout, and then we can elaborate and delve deeper into some of these issues, especially on demographic dividend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zandi. For a second, you almost took the role of our next panelist, who's going to be closing up today's proceedings. She is no stranger to developmental work across the country, across the region and continent. She currently heads the UN Women's Southern Africa Multi-Country Office. Ms. Anne Jikutu Shongwe, please take it away. And before I give it over to you, coming from me as your moderator, thank you so much for an insightful and powerful engagement. Thank you so much to Team DIRCO and UN Women for providing a platform for young people to convene. Young people in the group chat, let these ideas materialize. Less yada yada and more organizing. Thank you, and over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Kitsumetsi. My goodness, what incredible facilitation has that been? I really feel privileged. I think Sis Charlotte and I, as being the elders, almost veterans at this point, it's really a privilege to be in this conversation. And it has been, Namhla, I don't know, you're kind of near us maybe, but not quite. In the elders category, but I was just saying to Zandine, the message, I was like, my goodness, what an incredible panel. We need to have a deeper discussion. We really do. And as I was trying to think about closing remarks, as we are now really preparing for generation equality, I shared with you previously that for us, the issue of acceleration is top of mind. And what would it take for us to accelerate all these things what could that really translate into? And that those who run and are very powerful. So we would have to be really strategic about how to be heard. And I say this as, from a gender perspective, but I say this even louder from a young people's perspective, right? So how do we kind of take a look at that? And what does that kind of disruption of an inclusive macroeconomic framework look like? Because this is what we've been trying to do, is to say, if a macroeconomic framework does not say inclusive, then how do we start figuring it out? And I heard the other day from the DG of Women, who was saying that she has found that one of the only strategies is to almost be in bed with unlikely bedfellows like the IMF or the World Bank, whose voices are economic issues, but whose perspective is not necessarily the same as what we're putting on the table. So we need to think about what we would take. And I think inclusive macroeconomic review, and using Vietnam as an example, was that the sex disaggregation of data is still very. It still doesn't give us a deep enough view into some of the labor restrictions that we see, some of the really poorly organized labor market that continues to pin women and put women in a place where they continue to be so disadvantaged and unable to really engage in the economy. One of the exciting things that is emerging from the Generation Equality Action Coalition work, and I know you heard from Namhla, is on this issue of care work, to imagine, right, and this is some of the paradoxes that we're finding in our economies, is that to imagine that if every child that needed childcare and every parent, in most cases mothers, who need childcare to be able to go to work, if all of that happened, this economy could create up to 3 million new jobs. These are more jobs that the manufacturing sector, the mining sector, the different sort of high value sectors could create. So some of the strategies have got to be about, rethink young people and young women's businesses, be findable by anybody who, and I don't know, young people and young women's businesses, be findable by anybody who, and I don't know, some kind of really exciting, accessible database that actually begins to push through, because companies are supposed to be buying from you. Companies are supposed to be investing in you. But there is a huge pushback, and companies, this in our research, are actually willing to set aside the fine rather than do the hard work. So in strategizing, and I'm saying this kind of speaking to Zandi and Sis Charlotte, as we think about what are how do we make the opportunities much more accessible, so that we are really ready to take up the opportunities. A lot of discussion that we can have in all the different areas that were represented. A lot has to do with, and I really appreciate I think it was Busi's discussion about the oligopolistic nature of our. I've gone into a township and I see a new mall coming up, I want to scream, because somehow this should be against the law, so that the economies are really controlled by women and young women in particular. And where we have created investments, like in young women in agriculture, we have found phenomenal growth. And so even as we think about decent work and we look at the issue early childhood development, and we look at there are huge opportunities in agriculture, and it's not just in farming, but it's in the entire agricultural value chain. And we start looking at what trade is going to look like as we think about the new Women in Trade protocol. There are so many opportunities that I would put on the table for us to think about. But the bottom line for me is for us to be able to design together what could look like an inclusive macroeconomic framework that would ensure that all these different suggestions we're making are underpinned, by a real inclusive macroeconomic policy framework. I know it's hard work, but it's work that if you young people are not the ones putting it on the table, I'm not sure who. Disruption. It's about really looking for what inclusive and equal building back better could look like. Have your full support. We will continue to work hand in hand. And thank you so much to DIRCO for including us in this opportunity and for our partnership on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Anne. Zandi, can you please officially close the session for us? Thank you.